Well, frankly, I think that if you look at the timeline here, you'll see that that is just not fair or accurate. We issued a command paper in June of 2020. That command paper followed a mandate in 2 successive general elections to do trade union recognition in the private sector legislation. So we prepare that legislation and issue it as a command paper in June 2020. In September 2020, on the 29th of September, the Chamber of Commerce, and on the 30th of September, the GFSB, give us detailed comments on our draft law. The union, to its credit, had commented earlier in July 2020. We then met with the Chamber and the Federation and the union on various occasions and talked about the issues that they put to us in consultation. We then, having done that consultation and with the mandate of the people in a general election, have legislated in a way that takes into consideration some of the things that were put to us in the consultation. The Federation at least recognizes that. The union recognizes that and says that we've changed from the draft, and some of the things that we've taken into consideration are the representations of the Chamber and the Federation, which they obviously don't like. But at least the Federation and the union recognize that we have taken into consideration some of the things that they put in the consultation. The Chamber doesn't even recognize that.
Is it fair to say that they weren't given sufficient advance notice that you were about to implement this legislation?
Well, I'm surprised in particular at that comment, because in Gibraltar, we now have a constitution that requires me to publish legislation 6 weeks before we are able to pass it, unless it is urgent. We actually published the legislation in November, December. They've had 2 months to see it was coming. They haven't written to us at all, although the legislation has been published. We passed the legislation in Parliament 3 or 4 weeks ago, and we published the regulations the week after, and we've had no representations from any of the employers' representative organizations in that period of publication of the bill, or indeed since the bill became a law before the publication of the regulations.
You lead a socialist government, and the business community, certainly as represented by these 2 entities, believe or feel that the legislation is too weighted towards the unions. What's your comment on that?
Well, look, I must say to both the Chamber and the Federation, with whom I have an excellent relationship, that the facts don't bear out what they're saying. I'm very proud to lead a socialist administration, so you would expect a socialist administration to be proud of passing legislation for the recognition of trade unions in the private sector. But in the United Kingdom, this legislation, on which we have modelled our socialist legislation, was passed by a Conservative Chancellor, by George Osborne. So frankly, I think that when it comes to recognition of the rights of workers to congregate together in the private sector, to work as a collective, there is nothing socialist or conservative about that necessarily, because our constitution recognizes the freedom of association. This goes further and ensures that you have rights of representation at work.
But it's voluntary in the UK. Here it's mandatory now.
Well, it's not mandatory here. Far from it. Anybody who reads the legislation will see that it's only if the union is able to satisfy certain criteria that the employer is required to recognize the union. And frankly, I'm surprised that we haven't had a clamour from employers and employees to do this sooner, because this just brings certainty to negotiations and collective bargaining. And if anybody is on the centre or on the left, they must believe that that is a good thing.
Morrison's Unite members are currently striking, and we've already seen the impact of the legislation, because Morrison's management had originally threatened to not recognise the trade union. So it's important to strike a balance, isn't there? Because, you know, on the one hand, you don't want to deter businesses, but on the other hand, obviously, you want to protect workers' rights. So where do you strike that balance? Because, you know, how might Morrisons be feeling now, feeling that their hand is now being forced?
This legislation is not about any employer. And there's no question of us having done this legislation because of a particular industrial dispute now. This legislation was published long before we even knew that there was a dispute between the union and a particular local employer, and our timetable for doing it was to do it as quickly as possible during this current calendar year, because it's the last calendar year of this Parliament, and our mandate to do it was during the lifetime of this Parliament. So that is not an issue for us at all. But in terms of striking the balance, look, I think we've struck exactly the right balance. The legislation has been welcomed by unite but also criticize because it doesn't go as far as they would like it to go, and it's been criticized by the Federation for having taken into consideration only some of the representations that they made, but not all of them. That is how you strike the balance. We think we struck the right balance. This should not deter any good employer from coming to Gibraltar or continuing in Gibraltar. And let me be very clear with you, Ros, and with everybody watching. The S in GSLP stands for socialist. We don't want employers who are not good employers in Gibraltar.
One final question. The Federation calls it a burden, says the legislation is a burden. At a time when businesses are still struggling from the after effects of COVID, of Brexit, I mean, is it really fair on them now to be put in a position where they may face strike action?
I don't think that this is a legislation that creates a burden of any meaningful type. This legislation creates rights to recognize in the workplace that which is already, in my view, provided for in the Constitution, which is the freedom of association, something that we consider to be a fundamental human right, and therefore something we must see extended to people at work. Those fundamental human rights and the derivation of those human rights these days can be presented as creating burdens for some, because before you didn't have to recognize maternity leave,